when we think about the way in which we are moving towards this notion that it is normative to correct walls rather than to build bridges, it's problematic. When we think about the fact that children who attend public schools, many are participating in what I call a form of intellectual genocide. What does it mean when all children don't have a privilege for the right to a quality education, to quality housing, to quality health care? And let's be mindful that health care in this country is really about the treatment of an illness. It is not about the way in which we think about a quality of life. And all of these are issues that affect our understanding of human rights, all connected in some way to this false construction of race. While I will never know fully the effect of lynching culture, Black Elders' oral history accounts can function as a basis from which to evaluate strategies of resistance and visions of justice evident in communities across the United States, and from which to construct an ethic of resilience. And a lot of the work that you have done here on today reminds me of components of what an ethic of resilience might look like. First of all, you took a risk to have some conversations with some persons that you never met before. Some of you took a risk to be a little bit more vulnerable and transparent in the clarity of your responses. Others of you listened, and you listened actively. And you'll walk away from those table conversations today, perhaps just a little bit more determined to question something that when you hear it, it causes you to go, ah, that's not quite right. Some of you will go back into your communities, and you will think about the ways in which you are crusaders for justice, and the way in which your silence might be interpreted by some as complicit, and you'll think a little bit differently about your body language and your words when you're in those spaces. Some of you will go back into your families of origin, irrespective of how those families of origins have been constructed. And you might begin to push back on the ways in which language is used to demean and to dehumanize. But for each of you, there's something that drew you here to this conference. And I would like to think it's because of your commitment to justice. And that in that commitment, you're willing to read and to listen just a little bit more closely and a little bit more critically, and to raise the questions that some may not want you to articulate. As I weigh benefits associated with an excavation of truths, embedded and embodied in the minds and souls of Black folk, it is imperative that I acknowledge that courage, and I do a play here on this word, and I call it civility in our age, is intricately connected to notions of justice as persons look back to times past and reflect on current situations as a mirror by which to assess how communication and collaboration among groups and individuals might inform a national response to a war on blackness, and I could even say to a war on humanity. Allow me to suggest that it is virtually impossible to think about the contributions of Black elders whose oral narratives inform notions of courageous truth-telling without also recognizing that they, like their contemporaries who elect not to verbalize their experience of lynching, understand that memory extraction is not without some cost. It is this knowledge of potential emotional danger that will more than likely inform an internal assessment from which persons who live with historical reality that contradicts notions of human civility determine whether or how their truth-telling may further the common good. In this regard, courage is not an abstract trait. Rather, courage is a contextualized response informed by an understanding of self that seeks to actualize a prophetic mandate to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with the divine. Thus, courage is a reasoned decision to neither advance a conspiracy of silence that promotes miseducation or to condone racial hatred. Courage is a virtue that demands we acknowledge that truth, a way of knowing that is intricately connected to our daily experiences when detonated, when given voice and space, truth can have far-reaching consequences. Courage thus calculates costs associated with danger and imagines creative, liberating moments of truth-telling. To delve into, to extract, and to examine details associated with a specific aspect of lynching culture is to confront a landscape fraught with contradictions. Perhaps this is why, as Alice Walker stated so adamantly in The Same River Twice, Honoring the Difficult, that most persons elect not to talk about lynching and its residual effect to control human behavior through a silencing of countercultural perspectives. Thus, whether Black elders or surviving relatives of persons murdered on neighborhood streets contribute to our nation's historical record or not, each, through a process of internal assessment, signals that courage and truth are not abstract ideas. Neither are these moral virtues grounded in notions of absolutism. Rather, accounts of lynching culture across decades compel us to reflect upon lynching as a cultural production of domestic terror. Given this historical reality, courage and truth cannot be comprehended fully without a further explication of the role and function of symbols. When the very act of lynching and its primary weapon, the noose, are internalized to ensure a silencing of history, Black elders who came of age during this death-dealing era offer insights into moral discernment that afford me another point of reference from which to examine the impact of sustained invisible wounds. Life in the shadow of the noose is fraught with ambiguous tension, complicated by tradition and compounded by a desire on the one hand to give voice to practices that reflect, as I mentioned earlier, the worst of human nature, and on the other hand, to honor that which contributes to the well-being of all of creation, to participate in an always unfolding community. To acknowledge that Black Lives Matter is to affirm the dignity and worth of each human as inviolable. And here I read an excerpt from my book, Lynch, The Power of Memory in a Culture of Terror. And I quote from my own work. With the election of Barack Hussein Obama as the 44th President of the United States of America, many were quick to proclaim the advent of a post-racial society. This declaration suggests a pseudo-ideal that both disregards the uniqueness of humanity and describes a form of absolution that exempts certain persons and systems from past, present, and future acts of racialized violence. To imply that race does not matter exacerbates, as Modesta Corbin explains, and I quote, the reluctance to talk about anything that is racial, because in your deep South, and probably also in a lot of areas in your western states, those that border Canada like the Dakotas, you still have a lot of racial prejudice, and the conversation on race is not an easy conversation for most people, close quote. Rather than name racism as a national sin, there's a greater tendency, as Corbin opined, to sweep it under the rug than to talk about it. Clearly, a recent onslaught of deaths of unarmed Black persons at the hands of police and others counter any claims that silence is an antidote to diffuse a neo-lynching culture. At the same time, I acknowledge, as does Corbin, that those who confront government-sanctioned practices of terror do so often at great personal and communal risk. Despite a national narrative of truth and justice for all, Corbin rightly notes that how we respond to race and violence, and I quote, has a lot to do with the fear. And the fear is not necessarily a physical kind, even though that does exist to a degree. You have a fear of retaliation by economic means. The suppression is still there. And now, instead of using the physical, we use the economic sweep, and it can be so effectively used on both white and Black until it just makes it uncomfortable. Plus, you never know to whom you're talking, and so it makes the reluctance in conversation. Also, I think it's really difficult to face that because in a sense, you feel a coward because you don't face it. It's more comfortable to let it slide, and that's what we do. We take the more comfortable route, close quote. Perhaps like me, you may find yourselves increasingly confronted with racial issues that are cloaked in ambiguous national jargon, supported by contextually informed interpretations and applications. If racial profiling, excessive police force, and occupied neighborhoods are indicators of the United States moral barometer, we are, as Corbin stated, and I quote, really in trouble as a country until we can see how the racial divide is hurting our growth. Close quote. For Corbin and others, the growth to which they refer is not measured in terms of economic profit and loss. Rather, growth is determined by an individual and collective ability to recognize and respect the full human dignity of another person. It is a commitment to dismantle systems designed specifically to use violence to beget violence in a manner that disrupts and often silenced narrative regarding foundational practices traceable to this nation's initial occupation of this land. Ever mindful of the impact of words that seek to stifle rather than to encourage deep, honest dialogue that may well evoke a level of personal discomfort. Together, let each of us purpose to continue to do the work to which we are called, to engage in difficult and necessary conversations that are an essential component of social cultural change.